Welcome to the Spawn Chunks, episode number 270 for Monday, November 6th, 2023. My name is Joel Duggan, and joining me as always is my friend Johnny, but you may know him better as Pixelriffs. Hello, sir.
Hello, and we've been chatting all about comedies in the render distance this week. That's the extended version of the podcast that you can get if you sign up to support the show on patreon.com/thespawnchunks. And yeah, we've been giving our thoughts about some of the stuff we've been watching recently, as well as some more serious stuff over on Apple TV, Disney Plus, and a few other places besides. If you want to listen to our thoughts on some recent shows, that's once again available to our patrons. It is the first episode of the month, which is where we like to give a big thank you to everyone who supports the show via Patreon. And coming up this month, we have a couple of patron events. We have our Chunk Mail Dispenser episode, which was unlocked by our patrons. That's where we take a focus on community email for an entire episode. We've also got our monthly Minecraft Hangouts coming up at the end of November, where everyone can share in our Discord what they've been up to that month in their own Minecraft worlds. And as usual, the lively conversation in the Discord continues. We have channels dedicated to sharing your builds, discussing snapshots, redstone and modding advice, and spin-off games like Minecraft Dungeons and Legends. And obviously with the snapshots coming out right now, everyone's very excited about those, so a lively conversation is always had in the Spawn Chunks patron Discord.
What have you been up to in Minecraft this week?
Well, the main event, the headline, if you will, is that I was a participant in this year's Love Tropics event. Love Tropics 2023 was raising money for Sustainable Harvest International. The VODs of the event are all still up on twitch.tv/lovetropics, and I'm in the penultimate segment. The event overall went really well. It raised over $24,600 at the time of this recording, and I believe donations are still being accepted over at lovetropics.org. I'm not quite sure when they cut those off, since it's just like a kind of charity marathon event sort of over the weekend, usually the first weekend in November, more or less. And I want to applaud all of the organizers for the fantastic job they did, especially considering that the US and Canada put their clocks back on Sunday nights. So yeah, we effectively had to lengthen the schedule by an hour somewhere in there, and they had some folks filling time. But the server that they set up is all based around the Tropicraft mod, which has a bunch of like cool additional building blocks and additional trees and wildlife, and a lot of the stuff they had done was custom made for the natural environment and flora and fauna of Belize, which is where they were focusing their efforts with Sustainable Harvest International, effectively teaching people in a community around Santa Marta in Belize to practice good agricultural well-being and not like slash and burn and clear large areas of forest land in order to be able to farm stuff like sugarcane that's grown over there. Obviously, like, ties into the Minecraft stuff really well, because we all know about sustainable sugarcane farming as Minecraft players, but yeah, naturally this is a slightly different thing in the real world. And the event went really well. I was just helping build out a tropical themed kind of boardwalk area leading to the final stage where they were doing the finale and drawing a bunch of like raffle prizes for people who donated and that kind of thing. So I participated in Love Tropics a couple of previous years with the Empire's crew, so it was really nice to be a part of this as a solo act this year.
I know that a crop like bamboo is really quick to grow and has a lot of uses, anything from like building to clothing and stuff like that. And I know sugarcane is obviously used in sugar and alcohol and all this kind of stuff, and other byproducts. But does sugarcane grow the same rate? Like, did you pick up any interesting factoids about sugarcane farming?
It wasn't so much focused on that as it was focused on like the work they were doing with the farmers themselves and just kind of teaching them to farm stuff sustainably and that kind of thing. But like, yeah, sugarcane is just one example of some of the stuff that they grow over there. And the rest,
I see. Okay.
The rest of it is all like, small agricultural communities need a lot of locally grown crops because they don't have crops being imported from elsewhere for like, general diet and everything. So yeah, people are going to have to grow stuff for their local community. And I was chipping in a little bit of my own experience growing stuff in my garden this year and kind of thinking, well, there's a bit of a tie-in to my own lived experience there, but obviously nowhere near like on the scale that farmers out there will grow stuff. But yeah, if you want to know more about that, lovetropics.org probably has a link to Sustainable Harvest International's website as well. So there's plenty of places you can go and check out more about that and support if you want to, because it seems like a really solid cause.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of sustainable project like that, I always find really interesting. Whenever I see that kind of thing on social media, I usually stop and watch, even if it's someone's backyard greenhouse or backyard garden where they've got their own like rainwater collection and all that kind of stuff. If it's somebody that can present the engineering behind what they've done in a very simple, straightforward educational way, I always find it really intriguing because like it doesn't I mean, sure it's a lot of effort and a lot of planning, but it doesn't seem like it's that hard anymore with modern materials to get sustainable, growth even in your backyard, just for something where you're not spending money watering stuff when you can just collect rainwater and have it be watered automatically or use that water that you're just naturally getting from the sky rather than, upping your water bill and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and there's so many like very well informed folks who are assisting with the Love Tropics stream. Like I met Mommy Bell, who's a Minecraft educator, uses Minecraft in classrooms and stuff a lot, and had mentioned that she used the survival guide a couple of times to kind of get through to kids about some of these topics. And yeah, like the people were kind of filling in voice chat with me a lot of stuff about the local animals and being able to create like what's called like a nature corridor so that the animals can move around still, even though like there's human cleared areas of farmland around for like agricultural projects. Then there's still places where migrating populations of animals can go from one area to the next, so they don't get very insular with their local gene pool and inbreeding begins and that kind of thing. And so yeah, it was really interesting seeing some of the stuff about how they were helping to protect the natural environment and habitat for tapirs and all sorts of other like local animals. Most of which were just walking around us in Minecraft as we were talking about them, which was pretty fun. But outside of that, in the survival guide, I built the factory I was planning around my mud farm, which had been out in the open for a while. It was just the bare bones redstone of it all, so I've actually built a structure around that now. Haven't done anything on the interior yet because I'm kind of holding on for the new copper blocks so that I can have, factory walkways made out of the copper grates and stuff like that, right? But I was finally able to get that done, and that prompted a bit of a discussion about materials, which I think we're going to cover in the main discussion on this week's episode of the Spawn Chunks. But in the meantime, I have started using beacons, having killed the Wither last week. So I started, using that to insta-mine a bit of cobble and discuss other materials that you can get hold of with a beacon. The fact that you can set up a beacon in the Nether, which still blows my mind every time I do it. I'm like, oh, this thing can just go straight through bedrock? Great. And so yeah, finally I've got the ability to insta-mine for for cobblestone, which I think is one of those underrated things that you don't really think about if you've been playing Minecraft for a while, but now Deep Slate is the level that we mine at for diamonds. You so rarely end up having massive stockpiles of cobble from mining sessions that you can then use to craft dispensers and pistons and all of the stuff that you need cobblestone for further down the line. So I'm going to be doing a lot of that on streams, just to make sure I have those resources in the background. And the last thing I did was getting up to full netherite equipment, along with 2 full blocks of netherite, because I basically just took a bunch of TNT to the nether and spent an entire stream blasting out tunnels there. So I now have full netherite armor and tools, and plenty of backup netherite if I need it. Lots of ancient debris just kind of left over, but I'm hoping to do some building, or at least just kind of stockpile some of those resources for the future.
I would have to look, but I think my cobblestone stores are full from digging out the perimeter underneath my witch farm in the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's such a big area and I don't use cobblestone all that much, I feel like I still have a good half dozen double chests between that area and possibly in the nether.
Yeah.
Because we used to use the cobble in the nether for like all those blast proof early roads, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we just had an absolute ton of it. And often we would break it down into slabs because, of course, it would go farther, and you'd also have nothing spawning on the road. It would have to climb onto the road to be in your way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I don't know if I ever found myself in a place where I'd have to build with a lot of cobble for whatever reason, like a big structure that had a lot of cobble in it for texture, then I think I'd be okay. But you're right, I don't think about it. It's not something I've had to think about for a while, but I think it's because the world is so old, like
Yeah.
the Citadel being 6 years old now. We all started before Deep Slate was there. So any diamond mining that you did early on, like you absolutely just have a ton of cobble everywhere, right?
Yeah, and even in the survival guide, when I've gone mining for stuff, more often than not, I go mining with a silk touch pickaxe because I'm getting natural
Hmm.
stone, and that's craftable into a bunch of other stuff and stone bricks, and you don't have to smelt it if you want to make repeaters and comparators and whatever. So I feel like I prioritize stone too much, and I think, yeah, I don't need cobblestone. I'll have loads of cobblestone lying around, and then it turns out I don't. And I went to build this factory with a bunch of mossy cobblestone that I was crafting with the moss that I dug out from that chunk of the mountain in the previous week, and then I realized it was not moss that I really needed at that point. It was cobblestone, and I didn't really have enough, so had to go out and intentionally mine through some stone just to gather cobble in order to finish that build in the end.
Mm-hmm. I think the last time that I had that kind of realization was the early stages of any modded playthrough or like a Skyblock series where you're just like, oh right, I can't just use stone. Like I have to smelt cobblestone to get natural stone. Like you dig yourself into the side of a hill to make a little base, and then you've gone too far. You're gonna try to smooth out a wall, and you're like, oh right, I don't have any smooth like natural stone. I have
Mm-hmm.
to smelt cobblestone to get that, very basic, or what you think of as a very basic building material back into your inventory. It's an odd feeling when you have to go all the way back to square one.
Yeah, especially when you've been playing Minecraft for this long. Like in Survival Guide Season 1, I would have had cobblestone for days. These days, not so much. How about you? What's new on the Citadel?
Well, speaking of how long I've been playing, the Citadel and Westill had a mark on the calendar this past weekend. On the 4th of November, marked my third year on the West Hill project. I broke ground on the potato farm at the top of the valley on November 4th in 2020. And it is weird and cool to be in this area for this long. I do have, screenshots from way back in the day, and I do intend to, when I finish the project, have some like before and after stuff going on. But even just, going back and looking at the VOD on Joel Duggan VODs on YouTube, which has archived the entire thing. I think the only thing that wasn't there when I went to look was like the bridge and the path. Like I kind of made the medieval fantasy zone on the server, and then did some kind of like admin building where like you come in a safe area that's well lit. There's a path leading somewhere where you can start building and all that kind of stuff. And I did that before I started doing all the VOD archive stuff. But Westill in general, the bridge kind of stops, you get off, and there's a couple of path blocks, and it's just empty field, empty sunflower plains and rivers and stuff like that. And so going back and looking at how that all started compared to where it is now, where I'm getting to the point where almost every block has been touched by me in the immediate area, or at least, sculpted or been designed around to like divert your attention from like the weird Minecraft cliff in the distance, and just like, no, focus on this stuff here. And it's coming along. It's getting a lot closer to being finished than I even felt just a couple of months ago. Like just a couple of months ago, I really would have said like, I'm still miles from being done. But this past week, I was just landscaping. And in part, it's avoiding not knowing how to finish the inside of the keep yet, deciding on what data pack and strategies to use there, but also really wanting the experience of approaching the town to feel finished. And I mentioned this last week, where right now there's a couple of spots that feel kind of forgotten about. In some of the screenshots I've actually included, you can see like a very flat green plain in front of the main gate that's going to get a marsh, just like the one that I made last week. But this week was all about the side of the river where I had just completed that bridge and that marsh draining into the river last week. And then this week was just like I had, I don't know, a couple dozen, maybe 34, 48 blocks worth of space horizontally to decorate this edge of a river that, of course, meanders, south towards the east bridge. And I was trying to lean into the natural landscape without just completely turning into the Cubert staircase look. Like I didn't want to just
Yeah.
have everything look like it was a perfect slope. And so there was a natural spot where the Minecraft landscape was pretty jagged. And what I did was I replaced all the dirt with stone, and I made like a custom cliff and hung some foliage on it and that kind of thing. And it was a lot of fun because now I have more blocks than I did the last time I did this. I've got tough, and adding a gradient from tough to cobble to andesite at the base of this jagged, cliff in the river, it really helped it look weathered and wet, and like the elements like rain and water would have done some work on it. And it was a lot of fun having more blocks as time goes on over the years to do more with. And the strategy really wasn't all that complicated. It was a really relaxing week. Essentially, what I found is the easiest way to do this is you find your key features. Like there's the bridge, there's the cliff in the middle, and then there is the other bridge, which is the big bridge tower. And what I did was I just did all the custom foliage, like the very specific bushes and double high grass and double high ferns, like all in those areas to make them look very lush and dense, and that this building has been here a while. And those basically bookend these large slopes of riverscape between them. And in between, you can kind of just haphazard go around and place grass and ferns and moss carpet, the odd azalea bush, and just kind of work in that way. And I find that because the features like the cliff and the towers have a manicured look to them, and they look like the way that you want them to, they draw your attention, and your eye kind of just hovers over the stuff in between, and you don't really notice that it's just planted grass and ferns. That's it. The odd bone meal here and there to make it look a little bit less conform, but it's great. I'm really happy with the results, and the only thing that's left to do, which is on a to-do list for a much later date, and something I think I've talked about doing as like a late night stream or maybe like a silent stream with music in the background or something, is like the river needs to be, I need to swim through the river and remove stuff I don't want and just throw in a couple of odd rocks and plant, like hit the bone meal and all that kind of stuff. That's all done within the town, but I've not done that to the rivers that are leading down to the town. So there's
Hmm.
a little bit of stuff like that left, but I'm looking forward to finishing up these areas. I do think I'm going to put another build just outside the town. I think I'm going to put an inn on the cliff on the west side of the river. So right now, the east side of this river is done. Like, put a pin in it, finished, and that's a good feeling. But I haven't done the other side because I still think I'm going to put a build there. And just as I described, I kind of want the key elements in before I start landscaping stuff. Right?
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. And this is something I really wish was more of a thing in my area, is like there being a natural river there, since I'm sort of in a mountain biome, so I need to, if anything, create a river myself. And there's a river nearby that cuts through some of the landscape, but I don't have this amount of integration of the river into a landscape that I can build around. And I need to start terraforming in the area that I'm working in at some stage, mostly because most of the builds that I pop down there either look like they are just added on top of the landscape, or in the case of my storage build, because it turned out so large, cut directly into the landscape with a hard border, that I really need to take the time and do some of the kind of naturalistic landscaping that you've been doing for it to feel at all like, like the builds are meant to be there, and that they aren't just thrown in almost like an asset that you've dropped into a video game builder, and it's just kind of cut out of it, clipping into the landscape.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, it's a really rewarding process. I do feel like I'm in the same way that I get burnt out on brown and gray inside Westall. I'm kind of done with green for a
Yeah,
while.
sure,
Like,
sure, yeah.
as nice as it is on a rainy day here in Nova Scotia to be in a sunny Minecraft world building plants, as there's snow on the ground outside here or fall happening, it's nice to have all this greenery. At the same time, like, you don't have a lot of options in Minecraft for this kind of thing. And I find the most challenging thing about doing the riverscape is that I really like using moss and azalea leaves for bushes and overgrowth. It makes things look really dense, but that does not jive with the grass color in river biomes.
Yeah.
And you have to switch to oak leaves generally. And then that becomes complicated because you can't use I use moss blocks a lot to hide the edge of the dirt side of the grass blocks because I
Hmm.
don't have a texture pack that makes it like a grass side. I should probably remedy that, but um, those don't match. And I mean, it works if you make it a standalone thing. Like if you make a plant or a seaweed, like a river plant or something like that, sure. But if you're trying to like speckle moss and azalea in amongst river biome grass, it doesn't work at all. It looks like a really strange. There's too much blue in the river grass.
Yeah.
It's got the same complicated properties as a taiga biome does, less extreme, but it's the same sort of color difference.
One of the other things I've done this week that hasn't showed up on survival guide videos yet is I went to a mushroom island and wanted to like grab a
Oh,
bunch
fun.
of mycelium, and I threw down a grass block just to demonstrate grass spreading and whether it would compete with the mycelium for the dirt or not. And I always forget how incredibly cartoonishly bright green grass is on a mushroom island, and I feel like that was desirable for me once upon a time, but now I really love the subtlety of a lot of other biome colors that I'm kind of fine working with them. But yeah, that transition between river color, which is kind of closer to like mountain or taiga grass, it's got a lot more blue in it. Yeah, you transition into that off the plains, it can be difficult to shift the other foliage that you've been working with up until that point.
Moving into the news this week, Minecraft Java Edition Snapshot 23W44A was published on November 1st, 2023. We're taking a break from new features, says Mojang, to improve ones we've already added, including fixes to commands and the ability to use loot tables with decorated pots. Changes in 23W44A, copper doors and copper trapdoors have updated textures. Technical changes include decorated pots can now utilize loot tables and will read from the loot table tag key. There are also additional changes to the tick, return function, and execute if/unless functions and the commands therein. Bug fixes in 23W44A. Tough bricks do not properly align with other bricks. That has been fixed. Top of copper doors include an open part of the window. Copper door item texture is inconsistent with the block, and chiseled copper cannot be stone cut from cut copper blocks. A full list of bug fixes and the details of changes to commands are available at the Minecraft.net changelog linked in our show notes on thespawnchunks.com.
A small snapshot last week, and we were really hoping to see stuff like trial chambers and maybe the breeze, because those are the remaining features. I think I can't recall too many other things they mentioned at Minecraft Live that we haven't got in the recent snapshots between the tough and copper blocks and then the crafter the previous week. But maybe later this week we'll get a chance to go through a trial chamber and maybe encounter the breeze mob. But nice to see these changes being made, at least, because the tough brick texture was probably the complaint most people had about the snapshot from the week before, was that it was inverted or rotated weirdly or just drawn in a different manner that wasn't going to line up with the other bricks. And yeah, I think it makes sense for them to have done this. I think a lot of people are going to argue in retrospect that, oh, it made this block feel unique and now it just looks like another brick type. But I honestly think the majority of players will find it more usable if it lines up with other bricks, right? Do you feel the same way?
Oh, 100%. I found two things interesting about this. One, like I'm happy that they made the change, and it feels like it's going to fit in with a lot more of what I would want to use it for. And people were showing off like how it is a gradual transition between certain like deep slate and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, this is listed as a bug fix, not listed in the changes. So the copper doors and copper trapdoors have updated textures. That was a change. But this was listed as like, no, this is a bug. That the texture didn't change. It was like upside down or backwards or something. And so that, to me, interpreting that means that tough bricks were never intended to have the mortar lines on the top. And that makes sense, because if you went back and looked at them, not all tough brick blocks had the mortar lines on the top. The chiseled versions matched up with normal bricks fine, but just the tough bricks, and I think one or two, maybe the walls and a couple of other things didn't. And it's because that tough brick texture, of course, is reused on walls and stairs and slabs and things like that. And so I'm happy for it. I think that the change makes sense, and the fact that it's a bug makes sense, because it was an odd choice. If it wasn't, it's something I bring up a lot on the show, is when Mojang gets about 80 or 90% there on something, and then you just feel like, well, why didn't you just line it up with this? Like it just seems like it would make sense. And so obviously that was the intention, but then something happened somewhere in in the update, and it didn't come out as they had planned. And so I'm glad that they fixed it. I didn't work with them. I didn't load the snapshot up because it was such a small snapshot this week, but I did see some screenshots of the new copper door and copper trapdoor textures. And I think that helps a bit with what I was talking about last week, where the copper trapdoor has the exact same texture as the copper block. And
Yeah.
when you put them together or put the copper trapdoor over anything that's kind of that tealy blue green, like prismarine, copper, anything like that, it really kind of washed away. And the change here gives more depth to both the door and the trapdoor. And I think that help like make it stand out a little bit more when it's layered over things of the similar material. So that's a good change too.
I assume because you've got the resource pack on the Citadel that adds the 3D element to trapdoors, right? Where they've got the transparency, you see the pixels in the side that are emitted from the natively rendered texture in default graphics. So I assume you're going to do the same thing with the copper door once the textures for that are available.
Yeah, I believe I download that from vanillatweaks.net,
Right. Yeah.
and we're a bit behind. Like I don't think that I've updated it since Cherry trapdoors have
Oh.
come in.
Yeah.
And I know that I tweaked a couple, and there's a mistake in one of my textures where there's a very dark side on oak trapdoors,
Uh-huh.
and I keep on meaning to go and change it and haven't. But I really like it. I don't find that it adds a lot of lag or anything like that, and I much prefer the ability to see the three-dimensional shape of a door rather than just parts of it be like a pixel plane. It feels a lot more natural to me. And trapdoors, especially because when you use them in the way that I do for a lot of layers and decoration, as opposed to just functioning as a trapdoor, then I find it helps. Specifically when you're using them as like windows. You know how some people use oak trapdoors as like window shutters.
Mm-hmm.
I find that it's helpful in that way. I didn't implement all of them. I think that the texture pack adds depth to spruce trapdoors, and I found that kind of overkill. Like I didn't think that was needed. It's just the ones that have cutouts in them that I think were more interesting. And I don't even know if I'd have to go back and look because I use them so infrequently. If the warped trapdoors have any depth to them because they have like a weird windy organic kind of viney texture in them, and I feel like the crimson ones are more straight, right?
Yeah.
They're like a grid. They look like an acacia trapdoor, and I think there's depth on those. But I mean, what's lovely about texture packs like that is that you can download them from the source, and then if you don't like a particular version, you can just not use that texture. You can just delete it from the pack and just
Yeah.
incorporate it into your own, and you're off to the races, right?
Yeah, but I think the copper trapdoor is a good candidate for that 3D effect because it looks very industrial, and I think that's going to
Totally.
work. That's going to work really well. You just got to bear in mind that you've got to do it for all 4 copper trapdoors and all 4 waxed copper trapdoors as well. So it's
Yeah.
like it feels like 8 times the work for the resource pack creators, which is probably why we haven't seen more copper blocks before now. And I'm curious to see if anybody does something similar with the copper grates because that feels like an MC Escher drawing waiting to happen, where you've got all of this transparency in there. You can imagine like bars of stuff going from one side to the other, but then it's got to somehow like merge with the stuff that you can see through the other 2 faces as well. Something tells me that's not going to happen. I guess it's like leaves, right? You don't see people adding a ton of depth to the interior of leaves.
No, I agree. With the changes that they've made to chiseled copper and the crafting recipe, does that help at all with your copper math, or is the main culprit still like copper doors, copper trapdoors?
Yeah, no, it's still like you can still only make copper doors and trapdoors with full block of copper blocks, and the change with chiseled copper being stone cut from cut copper is because you need 2 cut copper slabs to make 1 block of chiseled copper in the crafting table. So you'd need cut copper for that if you were crafting them the traditional way, and obviously the stone cutter allows you to bypass that. But then if it's made from cut copper blocks in the first place, then you should be able to chisel a cut copper block into a chiseled copper block. And I think that was what they were trying to correct with the bug fix. But I'm still very like I'm side-eyeing the expense of copper trapdoors, knowing that how much builders enjoy using trapdoors and how much builders are going to be the ones who will want the amount of variety that you can get from copper blocks. I do think it's still a little bit too expensive, but maybe they can still tweak that. Maybe they just haven't had enough community feedback on that to make it worth their time yet. But we'll see once people have more of a chance to jump in and play around with these snapshots, which they should do if the trial chambers come out this week.
Do you want to jump into some email?
Yeah, let's do it. We've got a couple to read this week. If you'd like to email the show, the email address is spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. We try and read one or two emails every week, as long as they are short and sweet and something we can get a good discussion about. And of course, later in the month, we'll have our Chunk Mail Dispenser episode where we'll get even more discussions out of even more emails. This first one comes in from Imp Imperfect, and the subject is Bringing the World to Life. Hi, Pix and Joel. Something that's been rattling around in my brain for a while is that even with all the animals wandering around, the overworld still feels very static. Blocks typically don't change except when creepers destroy something, Endermen move a block, or sheep need a snack. I've tried to come up with ways in which the world could change outside of the player's influence, preferably non-destructive ways, like sheep eating grass. One concept I have is mobs eating leaf blocks, which then turn into something like branch blocks that over time regrow into leaves. I'm curious to hear what ideas the two of you can come up with, or maybe you don't like the idea of a sheep ruining your perfectly composed colour scheme. Imp Imperfect got lost in a forest because the trees kept changing around him.
I've never thought about using trees to find your way around in Minecraft. Like I always use something in the distance, like a mountain or, biome change or something to figure out which way I'm facing. I don't look at the trees as landmarks because boy, do they all look the same.
Yeah, and it's kind of
in a lot of
cheating when
ways.
you've got coordinates at your disposal as well. It's like if all
Well,
of us
there's
ran
that
around
too.
with a compass and were expert orienteering, if we'd all listened during Cub Scouts or whatever.
I'm not sure what color scheme would be ruined because, as I mentioned earlier, it's mostly green. So I don't know if there'd be really much to be destroyed in that way. But um, I would love to see some sort of change like this. The thing that comes to mind first over um, animals eating leaf blocks would be somehow for Mojang to work seasons into Minecraft. And I know that Sliced Lime created it was a data pack or a mod. I think it was a data pack that he was showcasing off last year at some point. And even if it's just a biome or a handful of biomes where this happens, uh, if they implemented it in the same way that they have lately, where they've given the players more control over features, where this could be turned on or off, maybe with a game rule, in the same way that fire tick, and vine growth can be stopped, um, or even give players the ability to control the timing of it. So maybe if you want it, but the default, how quick things turn orange and yellow and red, as lovely as that could be, if you don't want it to happen that quickly, if it happens too fast, if you could slow that down and say, no, 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 please just do this, at a much slower pace, so it feels more naturally to me. I think would be really interesting to have seasons change in Minecraft set at the same rate that they change wherever you are in the world. So, if you are in Australia, you would like it would be different for obviously when you're in the northern hemisphere. And if you had that happening in your Minecraft world, that could be really interesting to make it feel more immersive. Like so when it's wintry outside, it could be wintry in Minecraft. And on one hand, sure, that could be a pain in the butt if there's any snowfall. Um, but I think I was more focused on something like leaves changing color, fall colors. I don't know how you'd really get around leaves falling off of trees. I don't know if that's something that you'd have to go all the way in on. I think it could be something where Minecraft could just skip that step. Instead of having bare trees, they could just go from fall to back to spring again, like that kind of thing. I know it kind of skips a step, but I think technically I'd be okay with that. It doesn't have to be exactly like the real world. The branch blocks or branch textures that Imp Imperfect mentioned to me would be really cool and really useful for any kind of like custom trees, but I feel like you'd want, like, players would want to use them to build. You'd want to use them to make your own custom bushes and maybe even make your own like creepy dead tree, that kind of thing. And it would be neat if we could get them on our own. So sure, it might be immersive to have an animal eat some leaf blocks in the world. I'm not sure what Minecraft animal is tall enough to maybe the camel to eat a leaf block, but players would want to get their hands on it. And I mean, the mechanic of stripping wax off of copper blocks with an axe, I would imagine would be really similar if you had a leaf block in front of you and you right clicked it with an axe and it gave you like essentially like a bare branch block. That could be kind of fun, but I don't know how you do that where those branch blocks would then be able to connect to one another in a believable way, because it would just look very odd, like a star pattern or something, if it didn't connect the right way. So you're kind of stuck with blocks, and that's where log blocks and wood blocks and things are already there. So yeah, I'm not quite sure what would be the best implementation, but I like the idea, but I can see how it could be complicated from a gameplay consistency standpoint.
Yeah, I think the problem, I mean, the problem overall with stuff like this is that most noticeable changes are going to be destructive ones. Like, if you think
Hmm.
about the way Minecraft currently operates, there are at least 70 hostile mobs around you at all times in Java Edition. It's just that most of them are generated in cave layers, so you don't tend to see them. And on the surface, you've got passive mobs, most of which are going to be trapped in farms if they're around you. But I feel like right now, most of what I see in terms of animal movement, I see like horses on top of hills in the survival guide world, and so I spot those occasionally, but they tend to just kind of go up there and then stay there. But outside of the area of the player, mobs freeze in place once you're a certain distance away, and some of them will even despawn once you're a good distance beyond that. The game intentionally streamlines where and how activity happens, and obviously the change there is like, in permanently loaded areas like the spawn chunks, anything that's going to be changing constantly in the background because of mob behavior is just going to be creating lag by the nature of its existence, which is going to be a little difficult for the game to keep up with, and also for the technical players who prefer to optimize performance and stuff like that. You're going to have people clear cutting their entire spawn chunks just so that trees don't end up regrowing constantly. Either that, or you return to the spawn chunks and the whole thing is just a thicket, just a massive tangle of trees that have almost grown like brambles uncontrollably. So there's nuance to all of this, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea to add more life, but I think Minecraft's philosophy has always been that it is the player's role to enact change on their environment. And even with stuff like seasons, I can imagine them being something that the player voluntarily adds into certain areas because there may be other areas where you simply don't want them. And
Right.
it's difficult to say, like, I want this plains biome, but not that plains biome to have an autumnal color scheme, right? And so instead of it changing naturally as part of the environment, the idea would be you get autumnal leaves from somewhere else and you grow that type of tree there, and it just has a different leaf color. So you can add in an autumnal feel to somewhere, but it's not really going through an autumn in that sense. But I feel like there are other ways that you can add life to your surroundings that will make your Minecraft world feel a lot more alive. And one example I came up with as an idea is that if you add, let's say you've got a mountain nearby like I have, you can set up a couple of hidden dispensers on a timer, and after rain, maybe like you link it up to a pair of daylight detectors which could emit a specific redstone signal during rain, because of the changes in skylight. If that happens, you can then trigger these dispensers to spit out water, and it simulates water runoff from the hills after rainfall. And then that like trickles down there for maybe a day or so, like a slow timer is going in the background, and then it shuts off again. And so it's like all of the water has run downstream and it disappears, and then you're ready to like, whatever's next. Whenever it rains next, it happens again. And I kind of like little ideas like that, and maybe movable blocks, obviously using mechanism components at that stage because you've got to have like pistons and stuff, but maybe you have a couple of sections of your mountain that shift around as though to simulate like some erosion and rock falls and stuff like that. You can come up with fun ways of doing that yourself, but expecting the game to do it and expecting it to not interfere with somebody's gameplay style is a very difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you could add something like, in the same way a beacon affects the player's abilities within a certain radius, it could be interesting to have some sort of magical thing, which is magic is a thing in Minecraft, where it control, like, you could have the seasons happen within a radius of this shrine you've built with this
Yeah.
new item, in the same way that a conduit or a beacon work. You could do something like that. But again, that depend. Like, then you've got like, well, where does that boundary stop? Like, then you could have potentially people messing with other players when they don't want to. Like, there's a bunch
Yeah.
of stuff like that. I think the craftier solution, as you mentioned, is probably to have new trees
Mm-hmm.
with new leaf colors, or like, what? Just let us dye leaves. Like, why not? Just like, what was it? It was the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, painting the roses red.
Hmm.
Like going around with your dyes and painting leaf blocks different colors would be one hilarious, but also very fun and useful. But then again, you've got how many different kinds of leaves, and they'd all have to have 16 colors. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
gets complicated really fast. I would rather have something come in like a maple tree and just have it be red all the time. That's fine. Because then you can, when you want to have a red tree, you can just have red tree. That kind of thing could be interesting. I don't know how they'd have to add other colors, so I'm not sure how they do that. Maybe in a similar way to how azalea trees grow with like flowering and regular azalea leaves in them. Maybe you have like an autumnal tree that comes in like a maple tree that has both orange and red leaves. So you get both colors from one. I don't know where you get the yellow. You'd have to come up with a different way to do it. But yeah, there's some potential there, but I can see why, to your point, why you'd want it to have the player be something that would do it. Something that just came into my brain as you were talking about mobs. It wouldn't be a lot, I don't think, technically, because if mobs do freeze in place outside of a certain range, this would only happen a few times around the player. But it would be really fun if mobs somehow left footprints or treaded the grass. And I know we've got a path block already, and it works very similar to, like, you basically feel like you're beating the grass down with a shovel, right? What if there was burnt grass where creepers used to stand? Like if a creeper is walking across the ground and it actually burns the grass underneath it. And if you're quick enough, you can get the creeper and maybe pick up the burnt grass and use it as a texture. I don't know. I just, that kind of thing, even if it was a surface animation, like say the burnt grass isn't something you can actually grab. Maybe it's just part of the creeper animation and it just kind of disappears when the creeper disappears. But it would be kind of a fun immersion thing to see this thing walking across the landscape and sizzling it as it goes. It's kind of a strange idea.
Kind of like how snow golems leave a trail of snow behind them,
Oh,
like
totally. Yeah.
something like that. Or you even make it a little bit more challenging, I guess. Like bring a blaze from the Nether, and then that way it's not going to impact your world unless you very deliberately brought a mob from one dimension to another, and quite a difficult mob to do that with. And obviously it's going to be flinging fire everywhere, so it'd be kind of weird that the blaze mob started fires in the grass, but the regular fires that it had didn't. There's all sorts of weird logical holes in it, but yeah, I like the idea of the world changing without the players, direct impact, but it would have to be done in such subtle ways that it didn't ultimately annoy people with different play styles. Is the takeaway from this, I think.
Our next email comes in from Kija, changing old mobs. Howdy, Pix and Joel. With last week's Snapshot 23W43A, we saw changes made to the bat model and animations. I personally love this change, and it made me wonder if we will see more changes to other mobs by making them more modern, perhaps making changes to squids or the 5 farm animals: chickens, pigs, cows, horses, and sheep. What other mobs could see changes made to them in the future? Kija tried to swim in lava while trying to follow bats in caves.
And of course, the bats always end up swimming in lava, so that's pretty apt, I think. Yeah, like I think this is something we've talked about on the show before. We've had plenty of suggestions for updating sheep to look a little bit more modern, especially now we have much more detailed feeling animations like the warden and frogs and a few things that have a lot more character to how they move. And I do wonder if it feels like the older mobs in Minecraft almost have that as their character. Like the idea of sheep in Minecraft or cows is that they are kind of stiff looking, and that gives as much character to them as them having slightly more detailed walk animations. But I don't know. I'm going to defer to you because you're the one with professional animation experience. But I'm sure you've got a few thoughts about this.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up because that's kind of where my brain ended up going as I was thinking about this longer. And I see both sides of the argument. I would love to have a few updates to the old farm animals and older mobs. We mentioned last week, I think, or I think it was a point you made about potential merchandise and marketing material that Mojang already has that would have to be changed or would then feel outdated if the mods, the mobs changed. There's also the in-jokes, like the very duck-like looking chickens in Minecraft, and
Yeah.
the dopiness of current old school mobs like sheep can be the point of like very funny things. Uh, I remember, I think it was Zedaf did some flying sheep shenanigans a couple years ago,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
mean it was very funny, right? And it works better because of how odd the sheeps look, right? And I do love the idea of updates that still fall within that blocky aesthetic in Minecraft. And, if you go too far, it feels out of place. You see it all the time in mod packs with super detailed mobs. They're wonderful looking in their own right, but they tend to not always fit within Minecraft, or at least they wouldn't if they were the only thing brought into vanilla Minecraft, where in the context of a mod pack that might have a lot of other detailed things like more detailed plants, rocks, detailed trees, then they look a little bit more at home. But when you're bringing something into vanilla Minecraft where everything is so traditionally blocky, then they can look a little bit out of place. So I don't think it would be likely that we get both cows and sheep to have updates, but I really feel like their muzzle is something that would benefit. There's a little bit of a muzzle on the pig. I was hoping for something like that on the bat, but we see it on the piglins. Like you see that kind of stuff happening on some of the more modern mobs, and it does a lot. And even just to keep that blocky aesthetic, but add ears, like anything that's on an animal that can flop around. And animals use their ears all the time. When you think about like dogs and cats and wild animals, their ears are always moving. And if they've got particularly big ears or floppy ears like the piglins, then they move around creating some secondary action, which is an animation term, but it gives weight to a character. You think about anything, really like if you look at any old Disney animation and you watch any female character move around that has a long dress on and have that how that dress swoops around from side to side after the character has stopped moving. And ears do the same thing, in if you can do that in any subtle way in Minecraft. And I think the piglin ears are a very good example of adding a lot of life to what used to be some very odd, stiff looking characters in the Nether. And I think that works very, very well, especially when you get into the zombified piglins where I think they only have the one ear. And so again, it makes it more of a dramatic change from one to the other. But new animations could go a long way. Like even if you don't change the model of the cow, you could change the treadmill like animation of its legs to have a little bit more up and down. I'm not saying add knees, those would be great, but like even if you made some changes, specifically, I think it's the Strider that has a really cool walk animation as a newer mob.
Yeah, it kind of like
And
wobbles from side to side a little bit. I think
exactly,
the sniffer is another great example
exactly,
of
yeah.
this. Yeah, like where it has this sort of shuffling gait to it, which is noticeable by the way the body moves as well as the legs.
Yes, and I think like having that kind of shuffle in something like a cow, which is generally a pretty big animal. Like if you've ever watched a cow walk around in the field, they're
Oh
not
yeah,
the most they're not the most nimble thing, right? Like they
yeah,
move very slowly and very directly, and I think that could be something that could help, because I find that it's the treadmill like hovering feature of the animals that set them as old, that make them feel old. But cows, sheep, horses, even villagers and zombies with new animations with the exact same models can be very, very um, what's the word I'm looking for? It can pull those models into a more modern feeling in terms of transformative. They can feel like they're brand new, even though very little has changed about them. I actually feel like something else while we're on the subject would be changing some of the behavior of animals, not just their animations. Because I find like this could be just anecdotal, but in Westhill, I've got a lot of pigs and it's become a gag and they've been named, so they're not going away. But there's like roof pig, river pig, sewer pig. I think there's river pig. Like there's pigs everywhere and they just don't disappear. And it's difficult to do things like decorate a very cool looking barn environment or horse paddock and not have it be something that the horses can just like escape from whenever they want.
yeah.
Uh, and pigs, same problem. But then also pigs just get hit by lightning, and you're just like, well, like I want to have a pig farm, but I can't because anytime lightning happens, like the pigs get turned into zombified piglins. And so like I've had stuff like that happen where I was really happy with this one little pig behind a barn. And then the next time I walked through the neighborhood, there was a zombified piglin walking around. I'm just like,
Hmm.
this is not what I want. So I feel like some of the behaviors could be updated in that too. But mostly I think if you're not going to update the models at all, then animations, I think, would be the best way to move forward.
Yeah, we've just had a brief exchange in our live chat between Civic Kitty and Alistair sharing ideas about adding piglin ears to normal pigs. And Alistair shared a picture from a mod that seems to add a bunch of like slightly more characteristic animations to some of these mobs. And adding the ears to the pig makes it so cute that I would probably think twice about killing them. And I wonder if that's another reason why they haven't updated some of these
Fair.
animations, is that like if your sheep and cows and whatnot have more character, then do players start to feel even worse about killing them, which I mean, arguably, sure, that's up to the player. That's really down to whether or not the player has that kind of sympathy for the farm animals that they're raising for meat or whatever. But I am curious if that's part of it. If the Mojang team thinks, well, maybe fewer people will bring themselves to try and get meat out of these animals if the animals are too cute to begin with. Because you think about some of the stuff that they've added recently, they're not animals for meat. They're not animals for like killing for mob drops. You think about the frog and it's adorable. Even the warden, you're not supposed to kill because that's not the intended experience, and that's got one of the more detailed animations in the game. So I'm kind of curious about like whether or not they feel like it is worth updating these because of the ways in which we currently use those animals, and whether the animation is wasted on the fact that they are just going to be killed, or whether the animation makes players less likely to use them for their intended utility within game.
Did they not do that with horses in terms of the sound that they make when you hurt them? Like they really make it an uncomfortable squealing
Yeah,
shriek. Like
they
it's
kind of
not, I
did.
mean, not that I want to, because well, you also, I think you only get like, is it leather
Yeah, you
from the
get leather
horse?
from them. That's it.
Yeah. But you get more from a cow, maybe. They don't make it enticing to kill horses, which
Yeah.
is fine. I wouldn't want to. And I think in general, most people think about horses as farm animals and pets as opposed to, slaughter and use for
Yeah, they're
those kind of
mounts
things.
in Minecraft,
Yeah.
especially. Yeah,
Yeah. You can't ride a cow, although that would be very funny.
it would be.
Um, you'd be really moving, right? That's
Yeah,
just, I'm sorry.
very good,
Matinees on
very good.
Thursdays, folks,
Yes,
every week.
you can ride pigs. It is a point that you can ride pigs, and if the pigs had extra floppy ears, then yeah, I'd probably never slaughter one again. But speaking of horses, you bring up horses. The horse model was simplified a little while ago. Like, they didn't make it more detailed, they made it less detailed in a sense. And that was to unify the art style with a bunch of the other mobs. And they have still stuck to that art style while obviously giving the newer mobs different models. In the case of, like, we keep bringing up the frog, but I think the frog is obviously the most preeminent example of this. It has so much life to it and so much froggy behavior to it, just in the fact that it's got, an expandable throat, and the waddle that, when the legs move, kind of propels it along. But it's still made out of blocks and flat planes, and that's kind of it. And so the horse obviously felt too detailed for them. They have like an in-game, an in-house style guide of how they want to construct mobs. And I think the wither maybe got changed a little bit, and then the horse got changed a little bit. And I think going back to the example of the bat from this email, the bat had a lot of stuff that was wrong with it in retrospect, like how small but pixel dense the face was, and the overall shape of the ears. I think it was the inconsistency with the overall art style of the game now that made it a good candidate for change, not just comparing it to the newer mob designs and animations and thinking we can do better. I think consistency is way more important to them than updating everything to feel like it has bags and bags of character.
And I think the bat also had a really strange flight pattern. It reminded me of a June bug. I'm not sure if you have those over in England, but
Probably called something different, knowing us.
Well, yeah, it's a type of beetle, but it's the kind of bug that just flies into everything like head first, like it has a helmet on and just headbutts everything, which is really off-putting if you don't like bugs, because they fly into you and windows, and they're really loud because they've got a hard shell. So when they hit stuff, it really sounds gross.
Uh-huh.
And they really have, like, their sense of direction is terrible. And so they're just all over the place. And that's what I felt like bats looked to me like they were just always buggy. They never looked like they were doing what they should be doing. It was just like flying headfirst into a stone wall for, a couple of flaps, and then like flipping over into lava, like you mentioned earlier. It's like, this doesn't look like it should be the way that it was designed,
Yeah. And I'm looking up whether or not we have June bugs over here. I think we have something called a June bug, but it turns out to be a different sort of insect. So, welcome to biology and the fact that people can never name stuff consistently. Anyway, we are going to move from mobs back to blocks because I had a topic come up in my survival guide video recently where I built this factory, and this kind of inspired by a comment from a survival guide viewer who I will keep anonymous for the time being. But they said, builders seem to forget another kind of mindset which can limit what blocks people use in a build, those who seek to use the blocks based on their context. Some people use stone for their stone builds and are not going to mix wool or concrete into the stone because it's not stone, despite the fact that they can add some colors not found among the stone palette. And this is something that came up just because my factory build that I built on Survival Guide is a wide variety of blocks. It's a gradient between moss, tough and mossy cobblestone, through some cut copper blocks of different stages of oxidation, into mud, granite, and finally red brick at the top. So it's block spaghetti, block salad, if you like. And I think it looks cool based on the art style that I was going for, but I can recognize some people's reticence to use materials that way because that's not how you construct a building in real life. And so I thought we could open up a bit of a discussion here about how much real-world context matters to us when choosing materials for a build. And I think this was a great thing to discuss with you, Joel, because you've just spent 3 years building a medieval city in which I expect you've spent a lot of time thinking, well, the materials I want to build have to look medieval. And so you're building with a lot of stone. How much do you stretch your build palette when it comes to building in West Hill?
I would say probably not much because I have a very literal brain a lot of the time. Even when I was doing cartoon illustration, I still wanted things to look realistic. And I have a lot of detail in my work, and I have a lot of detail in my Minecraft work as well. I have definitely had preconceived ideas of uh, heavy blocks in Minecraft in terms of like what they might weigh, even though there's no gravity really in Minecraft, so to speak, outside of a couple blocks. And sometimes that's dictated by just the name of the block, where it's gathered: stone, deep slate, wood, as you mentioned. The materials that you would imagine would also match my medieval fantasy theme. But then other times it's texture. I don't tend to use wool in structures because the texture doesn't look sturdy. Like, it tends to look like material. I think part of that might be because it's called wood, and that kind of earworms into my brain and says like that's a light material. But sometimes I don't use it because I find that the gray wool might be off in terms of like the color temperature and what I'm trying to do as well. But it can be very tricky to incorporate other blocks. Like, I find sometimes, even though light gray concrete powder has the right color and the material, sure, it's concrete powder. It sounds like a building material, but it still feels lightweight, quote unquote, as far as the texture goes. And so it feels more like a part of a building that might be falling apart or crumbling, in the same way that people use cobblestone on the edges of things to make it look like it's been chipped away or worn down. And so sometimes the materials that I'm using uh, tend to have that kind of artistic impression. And I'm sure a lot of it is subjective, like, because I've seen some really interesting things where people have used, coal ore and birch bark blocks in builds for gradients and different things in the way that you were describing, the way that you use different blocks in your factory. And I think that for me, it ends up being because of my artistic interpretation of what I want a medieval town to look and feel like. I think that's the operative word there, is feel. And I end up using more traditionally named blocks and traditionally um, sourced blocks, I guess, in that way. And I've deviated a little bit because, like, we've got cool textures and things like calcite. I mean, deep slate isn't a real, well, I mean, it might be a real world material, but in Minecraft, it looks like its own thing. And I feel like in those cases, I tend to lean more on the more realistic things and use the more fantastical blocks in Minecraft in special occasions. But something that people might not be aware of is like sometimes just artistically, you may find that darker blocks tend to look more sturdy or structural than lighter blocks. And I think a lot of that has to do with like light and shadow, which you, depending on what you're doing with your Minecraft and maybe shaders, like you might find that something that looks like a darker block looks like it's in shadow and therefore would be more likely to be put under something and feels like it would hold more up because it's a darker block. A good
Hmm.
example is looking at things like the different wood colors. And you might find that birch wood looks more decorative rather than spruce and dark oak tend to be used more often to hold stuff up with pillars, arches, that kind of thing. Whereas if you build, I mean, you can totally build pillars and arches out of birch, but I would guess if you built the exact same structure, an arch or a couple of pillars inside of something like, say, a church or a steepled roof or something like that, I would imagine the darker blocks would look like they would be holding more weight than the lighter ones.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think there's a certain amount of real world realism to blocks in the pastel color range feeling sort of flimsier. If you think about stuff like sandstone and limestone, sort of sedimentary rock types that have been used in building for generations, but are obviously eroded by rain and that kind of thing. And then you think about the amount of darker quarried stone. I'm thinking especially here in England, in like the north of England, you get a lot more of that stuff that really feels like it is built to last. And
Mm-hmm.
those are usually like, there's some lighter stone types in there, but a lot of it feels like it's more more dense stone, and that can potentially be from like volcanic activity and stuff that's just been it's like metamorphic rock, isn't it? That's been like put under immense pressure and has transformed the rock into a different type, and that's typically like the harder types of stone. And so yeah, there's plenty of weight there, and I think using weight to determine your choices of blocks is a really interesting system. And lately, I feel like I've been going in a different direction to it, and I've been looking at a purely aesthetic sensibility with builds where I don't worry as much about materials. I worry about the overall impression, and I tend to I tend to compare the build style to impressionist painting, and not necessarily in the sense that it uses the same techniques as impressionist painters would, but more the fact that the overall idea is a more sort of free construction and a less adherence to structural lines and contours, and it kind of just gives the overall impression from a distance. It's not necessarily using the most realistic combination of color and texture and shape, but if you look at it and say that's a factory from a distance, then it's sort of done its job. And the philosophy I tend to take is that most Minecraft builds, in the case of the way that I tend to build, where I start in one place and then I expand outwards and I have a few different projects, a lot of the time, on average, I'm going to be seeing those buildings from far away much more frequently than I'm seeing them up close. And when it comes to my starter houses, I'm not block salading the inside of a house where I'm expecting to spend a great deal of time. Like for builds that I plan to spend a lot of time around or inside, I use a lot more flat texture. I use a lot more, if I'm using gradients, I'm using very linear gradients that feel a little bit more structural. And there's a lot more simple decoration on the inside of there. Because I know that when you're standing next to block spaghetti, it can't help but look like block spaghetti because you're right next to it and you can see all of the joins between the different textures. You get the outline of the block that you're looking at, and that very much reminds you these are a bunch of cubic meters of very different material. But most of the time you're going to be seeing stuff from further away, and this is not just about player builds, this is also what makes a Minecraft generated mountain look like a mountain and not just a vague collection of dirt and stone blocks. I feel like the distance blends the textures together on the screen, and that helps everything look a lot more natural. If you look at a screenshot up close of my factory build, you think, oh yeah, that's a lot of very obvious block choices. But then if you look at it from further away, you can't see where the granite and mud blend into the red brick, even though those are very different textures when you look at them up close. So it's all about perspective, and I think it's the kind of thing that I'm giving is an overall impression of a type of material that's more designed to be seen from a distance than it is designed to be experienced up close.
I agree. I think scale has a lot to do with it. And when you're building something at scale and let's say it's a smaller scale, like the inside of a house or a utility room or whatever, then that is something that I also experience with some of the scale in Westhill being player scale. Like I don't really go super large a lot of the time. One, to try and keep it from being a super long project. I understand the irony of that. It's one of those things where uh, you know, on the larger areas, I've absolutely had a lot more blocks in there. But I still ended up picking things that are in that same family of like tough and cobbled deep slate and the ends of basalt and all that kind of stuff. Maybe a little bit of mud in there. And I would say, like, there's a good example of mud is the right color for what I wanted, but you wouldn't put mud, not mud bricks, not packed mud in a wall. It would not hold anything. It would just
Hmm.
slop away, right? So in some ways, like, you can get away with it in Minecraft. And I find it interesting too that you're talking about like the block salad, which is a great term, by the way,
Thank you.
of that kind of stuff, and that I still find that I want to do that, but then I'll end up with one block that's just too far outside that grouping. Like it's just the edge of something is just too pink. I think a lot about something like you're trying to do a lot of texture work maybe on a road, and you've got a bunch of different blocks, but then you get down into the terracottas and you're like, they're brown, I want them to work, but they've just got such a hard edge that it just does not blend in the same way that I want it to. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that these roads are something that you're usually 2 blocks away from because you're walking on them, as
Hmm.
opposed to using that kind of blend in a big brown wall that's 100 blocks away. You could probably get away with a lot more. I think that I think your comparison to impressionistic painting is fantastic, because like that's exactly what you're doing. You're picking a block that has an overall read of a certain hue, even though if you look at it specifically, it might have things like black or gray or something in it. But overall, if it reads as kind of like a maroon or a pink and it works with what you want to do from a distance, then you're choosing the right block. You see that all the time when people do those digital mosaics where they take an image like a JPEG from the internet, and then they make it a pixel art piece in Minecraft, and they make it large enough where the different blocks read as certain colors, because you're seeing a person's face, you're reading that as skin tone, even though it's birch bark or something,
Yeah.
or stripped birch logs, which is not at all. People are not yellow in real life, not like The Simpsons, right? But it works because next to a bunch of other pink blocks, it all kind of blends together in that kind of effect. And um, pointillism, if anybody wants to look that up on their own, it's a fantastic way to look at essentially very early pixel art in terms of
Yes.
how those colors were put together. You think that's a green field, but it's a bunch of blue and yellow dots that are just really close together in different proximities and different sizes. And from a distance, your eye just blends them together and ends up looking green. That's one of the reasons I always talk about color theory when I talk about building and stuff like that in Minecraft, because you can use all that information to your advantage. Like when you know that stuff, when you know the rules, you know how to break them. And I think that that's an interesting way to approach that kind of stuff in Minecraft.
Pointillism is absolutely what I was going to bring up next, because yeah, I mean it's a branch off of impressionism, is what it boils down to. And yeah, I think it makes so much sense for a game like this, and with pixel art being so common. I look at what Doc M is doing on Hermitcraft right now. He's reproducing fan art of his like perimeter project and everything, and the lore he's developed for this area, and he's got a couple of people helping him condense these down into pixel art murals that he can build in massive scale on the walls of his perimeter. And he's using blocks like warped stems and stuff like that in there. And I don't think of those as having a particularly consistent color that would make sense, but when viewed from a distance, it blends together and becomes the texture on the sleeve of somebody's outfit in this giant mural. And that's the fascinating part about it, is the fact that the game at a distance is going to blend that stuff into something that feels legible to the viewer as a complete picture. And yeah, from a material realism perspective, yes, building with that stuff makes no sense. Building with wool in a stone build makes no sense. And it really depends, I think, on whether or not, like, this is another facet of this argument, whether or not you are looking at something that the player is supposed to have built, whether it's a man-made structure or whether it's something organic. And the example that the commenter gave was being able to mix wool or concrete into stone for a stone build, but some people elsewhere in the discussion were also talking about using, wool or concrete powder as part of a landscape. And then at that point, the landscape is not meant to be something that the player has necessarily constructed themselves, even though you've had a hand in it. It's not like a landscape gardener is going, let's put down all of this concrete powder around here. Like, the idea is that the landscape is supposed to be shaped naturally, and if you want it to look more natural, you need to deviate from what Minecraft gives you in the first place, because Minecraft gives you a parody of what the natural world actually looks like, and mainly because there are blocks everywhere. And I think it's very difficult to give the impression that you've got a more realistic appearance in something like this. And real life stone is not always the same color, texture, and grain from 1 cubic meter to the next, much less, the dirt and grass all around us. And so, it's difficult for me to understand where people draw the line when it comes to the material side of things. And like, I look at the wood floor in my bedroom, for example. I see different grain and knots in every area of that. If I build my bedroom floor in Minecraft, in theory, I should be using all the same wood type, but it doesn't look like my bedroom floor at that point because it's just a repeating pattern of the same texture and it feels dull. And so, really, where do you draw the line? I feel like people need to sort of talk themselves into the idea of using texture if they want to get the most out of the visual impact that the game can have. And I sort of wonder also, is it impossible to make a house look like it has had modern stucco plasterwork done because we don't have a plaster block in Minecraft? Or do you just suck it up and use concrete because that's the closest available thing? Like, if your brain can make that connection, then I feel like you can start to make the connection to other materials. Having been to a mushroom island recently, I just collected a bunch of mushroom stem blocks, and I look at those and I think that looks like it could be stucco. But then people are going to say, no, that's mushroom stem. You're using the stem of a fantastical giant mushroom in order to build a wall. That's not going to jive with me. And I just sort of think, well, where can we find some common ground? Where can we find the compromise? Because it feels like you're throwing away something that could look like a good block and you're reading the name of it. If you renamed mushroom stem to stucco plaster and you gave that to somebody, would that be enough for them to understand that they could use the block that way? Like, all it is semantics at that stage, which is really difficult for me to get behind because I'm somebody who loves interpretation and seeing the gray areas of stuff like that. Not just in Minecraft, but in, the TV that I watch deals with a lot of those kind of gray areas and kind of, philosophical problems. And I think it's kind of fun to try and reach beyond that and see what actually matters to you, whether it's the impression of what you're trying to convey or whether it is material exactitude in this case.
I'm glad you brought up the mushrooms because that reminds me that I have used mushrooms on a couple of occasions for different houses in West Hill, and the front gate is mostly bone block, which is weird.
Yeah,
now that I think about it, right?
That's a way to scare off the advancing armies. We have a gate made entirely out of cubic meters of human bones that were, pulled out of undead skeletons from the area, right? Like, but bone block, excellent example. Really great building block. Wouldn't change it for the world. Very, very sinister if you actually use it in real life, though.
Yeah, that kind of thing I think is there can be things that are taken too literally, and I think that for me it's less about what the block is called and where it's from most of the time, and more about like what is the artistic visual impression that it gives. I talked about weight and things like that, but that kind of process of blocks that are not supposed to be, in that environment, I think is more forgiving when you get into more organic stuff. You mentioned landscaping and using like green concrete powder, to kind of vary up your grass textures a little bit here and there. I recently was reminded, because we have so many blocks now in Minecraft, I forget about stuff, that the tops of azalea saplings is another great way to increase the variety in some landscape. You're burying a tree up to the top. It's weird, but it works, in terms of the texture. Also, using things like fence gates, fences, stairs, and slabs to make custom trees. we don't have any other options. We don't have the branch block that was mentioned earlier in the email section. And so players have to do that. And it's a hit or miss. You and I have had that discussion, on the podcast. Sometimes I really like fence gates in certain places, and you just can't unsee fence gates hanging in trees, And it's that suspension of disbelief and that use case where um, I find that it's a little bit more forgivable in things that are weirdly in Minecraft. It's the organic stuff that's a little bit easier to get around. Like I'm putting mangrove roots inside of bushes and inside of trees to make it look like the branch blocks that we don't have. But it's a root block. If I took it literally, I should only put it under things. Like it shouldn't go on the top of a tree. It should go only in the bottom. And there are lots of examples like that I think you get more freedom with in anything that's a little bit more organic. Like I think if I don't have any exact examples, but I remember seeing things from like Gemini Tay and other builders that make these really large kind of sculpture like dragons or fantastical fairies or whatever. And the blocks that they're using in those builds are purely color. Like it doesn't matter what the material is. If it's the right gray or if it's the right yellow or pink, it's going in that build, because at that scale, it's a lot more forgivable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it boils down to the same thing as the pixel art, really. Like it's just meant to convey an overall impression. And like I will obviously play both sides of this argument a little bit, and I think many more of us should be doing more with shape. And I think materials can often be a crutch to make a build look interesting when the overall shape would need some work. And I tried to do a little bit of this in Season 2 of Empires, where I built my museum build. I began designing everything by building the entire structure out of stone, including stairs and slabs of just natural stone, so that I could work on the shape and make sure I was happy with the shape before I started filling in the texture. And I wanted it to have like a strong silhouette and be like functionally very symmetrical, and that was quite helpful. So you can start by doing that as a drafting process, and then once you've got the shape right, then you can focus on filling in sections of material. And I think that allows you to contemplate the realism a little bit more and to avoid just imagining that block spam is going to make your build overall look better. The reason I tend to do it is that, like, I tend to focus a little bit more on the block salad texturing, is that I end up knowing what the shape is going to be, and I'm happy with the shape afterwards. And there are some sections on the factory build that I ended up just working with bricks, but making sure that the shape was more interesting so that it gave it a little bit more character at that stage, because it was beyond the area where I'd gradiated the material, and to continue the gradient higher would have felt a little bit strange. But I think, overall, you can imagine a situation like in West Hill where people would have quarried the material locally, right? Like if you're working with the level of realism and the thematic style that you are going with, you've got a bunch of materials which realistically they've got a lot of spruce and dark oak woods, and the wood could be stained, so that could very easily just have come from the same trees and just be stained with different types of material. But then all of the stone has probably come from under the ground. There's probably a quarry nearby or mines or whatever, where they've been digging up large quantities of stone that they've used to build the town. And with the majority of the town being that way, it sells the overall idea of it being a very localized and locally materially driven society. And I think that's great for medieval. And, bone blocks aside, and, the occasional prismarine roof that I know you've done in this side for, like, the richer part of town, I feel like the majority of it works so well because it stays within medieval building materials, which is what a lot of Minecraft's resource tree is based around, is, acquiring cobblestone and everything else. But then as soon as you push past that, you start to run into problems where if you're inventing something, then often you don't know what that is made out of, and there are some materials that are used in modern building methods in the real world that simply aren't available in Minecraft, so you have to adopt the next best thing. And at a certain point, once you're adopting the next best thing, then it's a slippery slope down to using cut copper in the side of a factory building made out of bricks. I just think it's more fun for me, and other people may think differently, and it's entirely fine if they do, but I think it is a lot more fun for me to imagine the overall impression of a build and use a variety of blocks and allow yourself to see those gray areas a little bit, because ultimately it lends itself to a different build style, and it maybe doesn't work as well if you're trying to build within a certain theme, but by that point you've laid out a block palette and you understand what your theme is. Whereas right now I'm just throwing everything at this spawn area and building whatever I think looks good. I think if you've got a thematic area like West Hill, you're going to be a lot more focused about that, and that is where relying on materials pays off a lot better.
Yeah, 100% agree. I have definitely even had that conversation when people are suggesting block choices in chat on stream, where I'm just like, well, I'm not going into the orange and, or heavy into the terracottas, because there doesn't look like there'd be a lot of it around, right? With a taiga and a plains biome being the only thing in render distance, and no ocean access. Like, I mean, and that's just my logical brain kicking in and going like, yeah, we'll do some forest green. There is a yellow terracotta tower, but it's very special. Like, it's not everywhere. It doesn't look like the cliff sides in Brazil, where everything is like pink and green and blue. And I think also the Philippines has a lot of bright colors and stuff like that. And that's just not the case for West Hill, because it wouldn't work with the vibe. I definitely have that into consideration. And I appreciate what you talk about shape as well, because, as a character designer, shape is king. Shape and silhouette for reading a character instantly. And when it's done very well, it's almost impossible to mistake that character for something else. Think about Mickey Mouse, for example. If you take Mickey Mouse in a good pose and black him out, like complete silhouette, everybody knows it's Mickey Mouse. And same thing, if you put him next to Goofy, you're not going to mix the two up at all, right? And only after that can you layer in. I mean, you can put Mickey Mouse in any costume you want, and when you black it out, it still looks like Mickey Mouse. And I think if you're approaching your builds in Minecraft with that idea of shape and depth, which is just the layers of shape together, then when that reads well, and then you go back in and you use the blocks to reinforce that shape, reinforce that depth, that is, I think, where you get some freedom, where you can say, okay, well, I've already made this entrance, 3 or 4 blocks deep, which means it doesn't all have to be stone. Like, as I get layered in there and I want it to be darker, I could switch to something else like mud. If it's the right dark gray for the inside of this door frame, it's going to make it look creepy, or whatever you're going for. Then do it, because you've done that work with the shape to help you get more freedom with your texture. Whereas if you did that on a flat surface and you just kind of put mud next to brick, like, it's going to look a little bit funny in a straight line,
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I'm now thinking that Block Salad would have been a great alt title for the podcast. Like, if we hadn't come up with the spawn chunks, I feel like Block Salad would also have been a solid choice. But that is where we're going to wrap up this episode of The Spawn Chunks. It could have all been so different. You can find more information about the show and links to some of the stuff that we talked about today over at thespawnchunks.com. The music for the show is composed by me, and The Spawn Chunks is proud to be a listener-supported podcast. If you're getting some value out of the show, why not consider putting some value back in? You can visit patreon.com/thespawnchunks to join our community, where pledging at any level gets you an invite to our patrons-only Discord chat. You can listen to the show live when we record it in Discord every Monday, and our monthly Minecraft audio hangout comes up at the end of the month, so you can show us what you've been doing in your Minecraft worlds. We currently have 326 patrons, which is down a few from last week, but probably just the Patreon reshuffle to blame there. Special thanks go out to our content engineer patrons who help make this show possible. Thank you, Hunter555, Jumbo Sale, Mindtrip Media, Party Voyager, and Yitz for your support on this episode.
Sharing the podcast with your friends is the easiest way to support the show. You can find us at The Spawn Chunks on Twitter and Instagram. Personal recommendations are by far the best way to share the podcast. Just poke a friend in the arm from a safe distance and let them know that they can listen on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a rating and a review on your favorite platform. You can email the show at spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. The RSS feed is linked in the spawnchunks.com, and the Patreon-only RSS feed is on the Patreon page. That's where you can listen to the render distance, the extended version of the podcast.
My name is Johnny, but online I go by Pixelriffs. You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/Pixelriffs, where the Minecraft Survival Guide is currently in its third season. I stream 3 days a week on Twitch, where I do behind-the-scenes work for my YouTube series, and I'm the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, which you can find through a quick YouTube search. Aside from that, I'm at Pixelriffs on both Twitter and Instagram. Joel, where can people find you online?
Everything that I'm doing online can be found at joelduggan.com. That includes links to the Citadel Cafe, my other podcast about sci-fi and fantasy entertainment. Stephen ESC and I hung out and talked about Loki Season 2 so far this week, and that is available now. My name is Joel Duggan on social media, Joel Duggan on Twitch. I'm very easy to find, and I stream Thursday through Sunday with a couple of extra days coming up in the near future because Satisfactory has made a comeback on the channel. But of course, I am focusing on the Citadel and West Hill in Minecraft.
Thanks for visiting the Spawn Chunks. Oh baby, the world outside is infinite. Block salad and sniffer eggs.